Boris Johnson's main problem is that he's obsessed with public relations and he's not diligent enough to study a problem carefully and in depth. That's not me saying that, that's former Supreme Court Judge Lord Sumption in a recent podcast with The Telegraph.
Boris Johnson's main problem is that he is obsessed with PR and he is not diligent enough to study a problem carefully and in depth.
Which is a judicial way of saying that Johnson is a vacuous cretin who's desperate to look good. But even that totally blunt dismissal is not the main takeaway from the encounter. That would be this 28-second velvety-toned atomic bomb.
The quarantine rules have been made under the Public Health Control of Disease Act of 1984. Now, there is no agreement among lawyers about what I'm about to say, but I do not myself believe that that act confers on the government the powers which it is purported to exercise, because it is a basic principle of British constitutional law that you cannot invade fundamental rights by using general terms.
Did you hear that little verbal intake of breath from the interviewer in the background? Well might she gosh. This is a former Supreme Court judge saying that, in his opinion, Johnson has acted illegally.
I do not myself believe that that act confers on the government the powers which it is purported to exercise.
I know he's spoken about it philosophically before, but I'm not sure if previously Sumption has weighed in with his opinion on the actual legality of the coronavirus regulations. And this is just now 2 weeks before the recommencement of the legal challenge. The appeal request will be heard, that's the request, not the appeal, Simon, getting ahead of yourself there, during the week commencing 28th of September, which is just 2 weeks from now. Not 2 months before, giving people time to forget, and not 2 days before, which would be too early for it to register, but just sufficient time for it to sink into the relevant areas of awareness. Is this a coincidence? I don't know, but it could not have been at a worse time for the man who he describes as
not diligent enough to study a problem carefully and in depth.
I am not convinced that Sumption's pristine timing is a coincidence. I think he's gone out of his way to ensure that his words are heeded as much as they possibly can be. And in his explanation, he goes on to accuse Johnson of extraordinary skullduggery, absolutely breathtaking levels of skullduggery for the purposes of avoiding parliamentary scrutiny. Basically, he describes the stuff of banana republics. I'm going to play a 2-minute clip here. I will summarise it afterwards and then look a bit more at the details.
The lockdown and the quarantine rules and most of the other regulations have been made under the Public Health Control of Disease Act of 1984, which was extensively amended in 2008. The government has deliberately, I must assume deliberately because they have plenty of legal advice, they have used an act which, to put it at its lowest, its application is profoundly controversial. In my view, an act which doesn't confer the powers. Now, the oddity is the government does have power to do what it has done under another act, which it has declined to use, the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004. The Civil Contingencies Act is concerned with emergencies, including health-related emergencies, and it empowers ministers to do anything that could be done by an Act of Parliament. Now, you cannot get wider words than that. Why haven't they used it? Now, the only reason that I can think of for not using it is that the Civil Contingencies Act has very stringent provisions for parliamentary scrutiny. A regulation under the Act is only provisionally valid for 7 days unless it is approved by Parliament. Thereafter, it only has validity for 30 days. It has to be renewed every 30 days. Moreover, exceptionally, there are provisions entitling Parliament to amend a regulation which is laid before it or to revoke it at any time. Now, the only reason that I can think of why the government did not use the one piece of legislation that was plainly applicable is that it wished to avoid parliamentary scrutiny. I have to assume that because the government has plenty of highly qualified legal advice, both in-house and from external independent advisors. I find it impossible to believe that they did not look carefully at all the legislative options available to them before they took these drastic decisions.
Johnson knew there was an appropriate act to underpin the coronavirus regulations. He chose not to use it because it had far-reaching powers and so very tight control mechanisms. And Johnson was after Banana Republic powers, so he used the 1984 Public Health Act, which was never intended to be used for such far-reaching powers, and so had no tight control mechanisms, which is an astonishing abuse of power. So here is a very quick scan through what Sumption was talking about there, the 2004 Act. Here we go, meaning of emergency, nothing surprising there. Who can make these regulations then? A senior minister of the Crown, that'd be him, may make emergency regulations if satisfied, yada yada yada. Scope. Emergency regulations may make any provision which the person making the regulations is satisfied is appropriate for the purpose of preventing, controlling, yada 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 yada. And then another, any provision for protecting and treating people. Any provision. Open-ended, and so the safeguards kick in. Duration. Emergency regulations shall lapse at the end of the period of 30 days beginning with the date on which they are made, or at such earlier time as may be specified in the regulations. Parliamentary scrutiny. Where emergency regulations are made, a senior minister of the Crown shall, as soon as is reasonably practicable, lay the regulations before Parliament, and the regulations shall lapse at the end of the period of 7 days beginning with the date of the laying, unless, during that period, each House of Parliament passes a resolution approving them. Far-reaching powers, and so with safeguards built in. Johnson wanted far-reaching powers, but he didn't want to be accountable, so he rejected the 2004 Act and used the 1984 Public Health Act, which doesn't have any safeguards built in because it was never intended for that purpose. It was never intended to be used to underpin far-reaching powers, and in Sumption's opinion, illegitimately. And he goes on to say, I will play this clip right at the end, but I'll just explain it a bit for now. He goes on to say he believes it's illegal because there is a lack of any specificity in the 1984 Act other than the powers of magistrates to quarantine potentially infectious people. And that's the relevant section of the Act where it lists the various powers local magistrates do have, which government ministers do not have. And he says that British constitutional law requires specificity when dealing with those types of powers, otherwise things tend to go wrong, which is why, in his weighty opinion, Johnson, the PR-obsessed cretin, to almost use his own words, is acting illegally. Blatant abuse of power. Refusal to use the correct tools at his disposal because they didn't yield the kind of Banana Republic powers he was looking for, and use of the incorrect tools illegally, illegitimately. So having laid that out, I'll play this video out with 60 seconds of Sumption himself on that matter. Bear in mind, again, that all this took place just 2 weeks before the recommencement of the legal challenge.
It is a basic principle of British constitutional law that you cannot invade fundamental rights by using general terms. If you use general words to justify draconian invasions of fundamental rights, there's too big a risk that it will pass unnoticed in the course of the parliamentary process. To invade fundamental rights, you have to have absolutely specific language. The only specific language in the Public Health Act which justifies invasions of liberty relates to people who are believed on reasonable grounds to be infectious. Ministers can only do things that magistrates could do, and magistrates only have power to control the movements of infected people or to control the opening of infected premises. They don't have power to control uncontaminated premises or healthy people.